Okay, hello. I am introducing week 5's environmental privilege concept that comes from Park and Pello's The Slums of Aspen. So we've got introduction and chapter 1 that we're reading. The first thing is that the introduction is very theoretical. So you'll see the concepts introduced there and the theories introduced. Whereas chapter 1 is the application of that theory to Aspen and the Roaring Fork Valley. So you'll see the first section is more theoretical, and this one is really more of the practical, describing how those concepts apply to this particular case. You'll notice that political economy is a huge component of this week's reading. So the authors are critiquing the capitalistic system and how our governing bodies are very much embedded in this capitalistic system, trying not to change status quo, and how that is a problem for our environmental issues. The reading also looks at mainstream environmentalism versus environmental justice, so that, which we already saw in the Colin Foster readings, that comes up again, and they're really teasing apart this relationship here. First, they're explaining the nativist environmentalism and its relationship to mainstream environmentalism. They do this by looking at the history of nativism. Nativism is this kind of idea of like America first. That may be familiar to you. This is where we're putting those who were born in the United States before anybody else, migrants or immigrants. So that's explained in the introduction. And there are a lot of social factors that contributed to nativism growth in various times of our society, which they're very similar. So the early 1900s, and the Park and Pello are really targeting 1990s, this growth that we've seen recently, and we see it also very alive and well today. So some of those factors are this growing economic insecurity, increasing rifts between the rich and the poor, so growing economic inequality between classes, increasing immigration, also the globalization, an increasing amount of globalization and free trade, intensified privatization of public resources. So all of those things result in some factors that encourage people to turn to a nativistic perspective. So all those things encourage, globalization, free trade, intensified privatization of public resources, encourage economic insecurity, declines in real wages, a continued disempowerment of labor movements and unions. So less strength or less power in workers' rights and unions that are trying to secure workers' rights. You see a major rise in temporary employment as a result of some of these economic insecurities. You also see significant cutbacks in the social safety net, including welfare and healthcare funding. So those are all results of free trade, economic globalization, and the privatization of public resources. But what happens is, instead of focusing on that underlying cause, there's this rhetoric or this discourse or this discussion of immigrants taking jobs. So you see you see people talking about immigrants being the reason why we have less social services, instead of this free trade globalization as being part of the reason why we have less social services or strain on social services. You see the rhetoric of immigrants threatening the cultural fabric of the nation. So they don't speak English, and that's the only acceptable language in the United States. So that's threatening to the American culture. Also threatening with a different type of religion, or a new racial or ethnic political bloc that might want to vote in a different way and change the status quo or change how we've been doing things for a very long time. So these examples of, the authors give us some examples of anti-immigrant policies and hate crimes that we've seen in public and college, in the general public, and that we've seen in various colleges and universities recently. This includes Asians, South Asians, Indians, and Pakistanis, who are then presumed to be Muslims, and then also people who are Sikh but are assumed incorrectly to be Muslim. So we see this rhetoric of anti-immigrant perspectives really further marginalizing groups. And what this does is these hate crimes or hate speech in these public incidences or these college campus incidences that the authors offer us, we see that it further marginalizes these groups and marks certain spaces as legitimate for certain groups. So immigrants or people of color are further marginalized, while whites are further normalized in these types of spaces. Now, the irony that the authors are pointing to here is this Aspen logic, okay? The irony is that you see immigrants being blamed for producing strains on the ecosystem when they are actually suffering higher exposure to this pollution. And so the Aspen logic comes in and really ties into this nativist environmentalism and these nativistic perspectives, and relates environmental justice to the privileged group's power. So we've been looking at environmental justice from like the issues that people of color or people with less power, how they've been dealing with these environmental burdens. Now what we need to do is flip it, and we need to look at how people with privilege have been dealing or contributing to these environmental problems. I'll get into Aspen logic in a moment. The other component of this week's reading that I want you to be clear about, this is a kind of underlying or kind of an undercurrent to the whole reading, is this new racism. And so new racism is a term that scholars use to refer to, well, we have like a colorblind ideology in our laws or embedded in our institutions. So it's like this idea of I don't see color and there's no difference between one group from one ethnic or racial group to the next. However, the laws are actually targeting one group without explicitly saying that they are. So this new racism is related to this nativist perspective, and some points are that environmentalism allows nativists to remove race from the conversation. So if we just talk about environmentalism, we're not really talking about race. Like, that's the idea. But Park and Pello really illuminate for us that no, these environmentalists in Aspen really are talking about race. It's kind of a proxy for race. We also see that the authors are critical of environmentalism in Aspen because they say that this lifestyle is only possible through a domination of the environment and a domination over people of color. So this is familiar perhaps from Polito. And domination over immigrants, the domination over workers who actually make these privileges possible. So there's a lot of irony, a lot of hypocrisy that is revealed here. And that the new racism is based on the idea that there is an insurmountable and incompatible cultural distinction between groups. So here we have a focus on culture and nationality. Our American culture is very different, and so different that people cannot assimilate properly when they come from another place. So those are very tied up in the new racism and nativism. They go hand in hand. So people use this to explain that certain groups are unassimilable, so people cannot assimilate based on other characteristics. So like, again, language, religion, nationality, or country of origin, things like that. So building upon the new racism, which is really racist practices that are less overt in their targeting of people of color, like they're definitely targeting people of color, but it doesn't outright say that's what they're doing. In addition to this, and the cultural arguments, nativist environmentalists claim that nations must obey the laws of nature to achieve and not threaten the natural biological balance. So they are inserting this biological component to their argument. which the authors, again, critique because it's really not just about the laws of nature. It's really about this racist or colorblind racism that is injected into their environmental perspective. So, it's kind of dense theory. I hope that is helpful a little bit to set you up, and when you go to read it, gives you a little bit more background of what you're looking at. I'm going to stop there, and then I'll get into a little bit more of the environmental privilege and Aspen logic.